in cyberspace and the world beyond. Thank you for tuning in today to the Western Heritage Center's filmed program. We have a really great program called A Landscape of Vice, Montana's Red Light Districts. We do a lot of programs for the senior centers in town. We love our seniors and we miss them dearly. We do a lot of programs at each of the retirement homes and senior citizens, and we wish them the best right now. But I will say the two most popular programs at the senior center are Billings Disasters and our prostitution program. So I'll leave that hanging there. I'm not sure, people love this topic, and we're really fortunate to bring in Crystal Alegria from Bozeman. She is the director of the Extreme History Project, a nonprofit that makes history relevant. I also like the tagline, history is messy. No.
History isn't pretty.
History is not pretty. And so anyway, Crystal has worked in the field of public history and archaeology education for the last 20 years at a variety of museums and organizations. She helped co-found with Marshall Fulton the Extreme History Project in 2012 and has helped build that organization in the Gallatin Valley into an award-winning nonprofit that engages the public through unique historical programming. And I'm actually very proud to say I've been a board member on the Extreme History Project since 2012. And in 2019, they received the state's highest award for history and research, the Montana Historical Society Heritage Keeper Award. So without further ado, my good friend Crystal Alegria, A Landscape of Vice. Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. You took my notes with you, though, Kevin.
Crystal, that was a test.
I probably would have failed. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thanks to the Western Heritage Center for hosting this presentation today. I'm excited to be here with all of you talking about red light districts across Montana. I started delving a little deeper into the history of prostitution in Montana because this past year, in April of 2019, the organization that I work for, the Extreme History Project, moved out of our offices into this house right here in Bozeman, Montana. And this house right here was actually built in 1891, and it was built specifically as a house of ill repute right in the heart of Bozeman's red light district. At the same time, we were developing a red light district walking tour for Bozeman, so for many reasons, my research interests converged on red light districts and landscapes of vice. So as we moved into our new office space and I was developing this red light walking tour, spending a lot of time wandering around and through the landscape of Bozeman's red light district, questions started to form in my mind about the history of prostitution and the history of red light districts. And so some of those questions I was thinking about were all red light districts confined into these small, restricted places? Did the women who worked in these districts own the land, own the property that they were working in? I noticed that there was Chinese communities around these districts. Did all districts have a Chinese community next to them? So these were some of the things. I thought I knew some of the answers to these questions, but I started delving a little bit deeper and reading everything I could get my hands on about red light districts and prostitution in Montana. And so of course I immediately read some of our historians' work here in Montana, Ellen Baumler, Mary Murphy, Paula Petrick. These women have done a lot of work on red light districts in Montana before, along with a lot of other people nationally have been doing a lot of work on red light districts over the years. So of course in doing this reading, more questions formed. So I decided to dive into some of this research and try to find some of these answers out myself for Montana. And the first place that I decided to go was actually to Sanborn maps. Now, for those of you who don't know what a historic Sanborn map is, the Sanborn Map Company was a publisher of detailed maps of U.S. cities and towns in the 19th and 20th centuries. The maps were originally created to allow fire insurance companies to assess their total liability in urbanized areas in the United States. Since they contain detailed information about properties and individual buildings, Sanborn maps are very valuable for documenting changes of the built environment. And red light districts are easily spotted on Sanborn maps because houses of prostitution are denoted as female boarding houses. So you can easily see those on any Sanborn map. And recently, the Library of Congress has uploaded a lot of Sanborn maps for each state in the country, but for Montana as well. So that has really been helpful because you can see the color versions of the Sanborn maps, which I have shown here. And if you notice, there are a few different colors on these Sanborn maps. The pink that denotes brick buildings, the blue denotes stone buildings, and the yellow denotes wood frame buildings. And then each of these buildings, can't really probably see it because it's in small detail, but it tells what the building was used for. So that's kind of where that female boarding houses comes in. So I wanted to use these Sanborn maps and ask some questions of them. And they were a good source of information to ask these questions of. So some of the questions that I mentioned earlier that I kind of drilled down to ask of these Sanborn maps were red light districts located near main streets? Were red light districts located near railroads, the railroad in town? Were red light districts associated with the local Chinese community? And I thought in my head I knew the answers to these questions, but in reality, the answers are a little bit different. So it's always good to do your research. So the analysis of this little mini research project that I had it was kind of interesting. So when looking at the Sanborn maps that were on the Library of Congress website, I found that there were 40 cities and towns across Montana in the late 1890s that had Sanborn maps. So there was 40 towns. Of course, in Montana in the 1890s, there were much more than just 40 towns or cities. But I decided to look at these Sanborn maps and just look at these 40 places. So it kind of narrowed my research, which was really nice. So what I found is that 22 of those 40 towns had red light districts in the 1890s. So I kind of narrowed my search to the 1890s as well, just to kind of narrow that scope. So what I consider a red light district is a grouping of buildings denoted on the Sanborn map as female boarding. So that grouping is kind of what I was looking for. So here's some of my results. Of the 22 red light districts, 11 were associated with local Chinese community. So only half were associated with the Chinese community. And of course, some of these didn't have Chinese communities at all yet. But some of them did, they just weren't associated. So to me, that was pretty interesting because I always thought the two kind of went hand in hand. Of those 22 districts, 21 of the districts, so almost all, were located 1 or 2 blocks from Main Street. So that is interesting as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that spatial distancing and why that happened. So of the 22, 11 had districts located 1 or 2 blocks from the railroad. And of course, that Main Street and railroad cut the time and the date that the town was founded comes into play, which I'll talk about later. So 22 of the 21 towns had grouped red light districts in the 1890s. So the red light district was grouped into one spatial area. It wasn't kind of spread out over town. And so most of those were not spread out. They were very defined and they were very confined to a certain area. So now I felt like I had a better feel for these districts and the landscape of these districts, that landscape of vice. And so, of course, as you do research, you often find that you have more questions that percolate up and you have more questions to ask. And so I, of course, did have more questions. And so I traveled to some of these towns to better understand these places. So, and I kind of chose 4 towns to travel to and kind of do a deeper dive into these questions that I had. And so those 4 towns were Bozeman, which was an easy one because that's where I live, and that's kind of where I work, is within the historic red light district as well. And so then I traveled to Big Timber and Dillon, and then I did a little survey of the Billings red light district as well, since I'm here in Billings giving this talk today. So these are the 4 communities I kind of did a deeper dive with. And so last summer, I traveled to Big Timber and Dillon in particular and looked at some deed records. I looked at some newspaper accounts. I really went and stood in the red light districts in these 2 places just to better understand them, along with Bozeman. And then this morning I did go and stand in the red light district here in Billings too. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But it was really interesting to go to these places and to do the research on these red light districts, and found out a lot of interesting information that I'll share with you. So I'm going to start with Bozeman because that's the district that I know the best, Bozeman's historic red light district. And so as you see, this is a photograph of Bozeman's red light district right here in red, circled in red. And this is from a photo that was taken in about 1890, 1891. So everything I'm talking about is kind of in that 1890s time frame. And so this district doesn't look very fancy, does it? It looks pretty, standard. You'd never, if you were going down the street, you probably never even realized that was a red light district. We have one big parlor house, which you can kind of see on the corner there. And then we have some other structures that were brothels, that were houses of ill repute, that are beyond that big parlor house. And so we have one right here. Can you see my cursor when okay. So we have one right here. This is a brothel. This is a brothel right here. And this little cabin, this little log cabin shack is a brothel. So it's not kind of what you think of, when you watch those Westerns and you watch all the stereotypical information that we have about red light districts. This is not it, is it? So this is what Bozeman's red light district looked like in the 1890s. And so this is the Sanborn map, and I'm just going to show you this picture. We're going to kind of get a closer look at that Sanborn map. So this is the Sanborn map from 1891, so about that same time that photo was taken. And you'll see that Bozeman had a few houses of ill repute, a few houses of prostitution at this time. And so everything that is in red is a house of prostitution. And so we have, this is that big corner one that I was showing you on the photo right here. And then we have a few others. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 houses of prostitution in 1891. At the height of Bozeman's red light district, we had about 9 houses. So that was kind of the extent of our houses here in Bozeman. And ours was a very confined red light district. And it was close to Main Street. So you can see Main Street right here. And our railroad is quite a bit farther north. So this red light district is not next to the railroad, unlike Billings. Billings is right next to the railroad. So the reason for that is because Bozeman was founded in 1864. And it wasn't founded as a railroad town. It was actually founded as an agricultural depot, kind of an agricultural hub where people would come to get goods on their way to the gold fields. And so that is why our red light district is right next to Main Street and not next to the railroad, because Main Street, of course, came first, and the railroad came not until 1883, so much later. And so that red light district was solidly established by that time. So, and we don't, as far as I know, have any red light brothels or districts that popped up near our railroad. They just stayed in this area here. Now we also have in blue, outlined in blue, the area where the Chinese community lived. And so you'll see there's about 4 or 5, there's 5 houses and businesses that were owned by the Chinese. And much like on the Sanborn maps, they denoted houses of prostitution by female boarding house. On the Sanborn maps, they also would denote if it was a Chinese person who lived in the dwelling or a Chinese person who worked at the dwelling. And so that's how we know where Chinese communities were. And so in this, you can see that the Chinese community in Bozeman was right next to the red light district. So they kind of worked hand in hand. Okay, so this alley right behind Main, here we have Main Street, here we have Mendenhall Street. This alley right here was known as China Alley, and it's often labeled as that on maps. And so the other interesting thing about these red light districts is there was often lodging houses run by women close by the red light districts that were not brothels. And so we have an example of that in Bozeman. Right down here you can see this place called the Fraser Hotel. And this was run by a woman whose name was Elmira Fraser. And she ran it as a hotel, and it was not a brothel. And it was run as a hotel and a boarding house later, but not ever denoted as a brothel, or no one ever confused it as that. And I always kind of wonder how that worked, since she was in such close proximity to the houses that were houses of prostitution. But she did not have to pay the business licenses that cost quite a bit of money. Her business license was much less. So everybody knew kind of what she was doing there. Okay, so let's move on to Big Timber and have a look at Big Timber's district. Now, of course, Big Timber's district is a little bit smaller because Big Timber is a little bit smaller, and it always has been, than Bozeman or some of the other towns we're going to talk about. So this is the Sanborn map from 1896 in Big Timber. And you'll notice that there is 3 or 4 or 5, 6, maybe 6 houses of prostitution in Big Timber at this time, and 1 building that was used by the Chinese. And so the red light district was, of course, very close to the Chinese community in Big Timber as well. And because Big Timber was a railroad town, this red light district is located right next to the railroad. So the railroad is right over here next to Front Street, which you can see right here. So this one was right smack right up against the railroad, much like it is here in Billings. Another thing that I wanted to talk about as well is that women in Big Timber did own some of this property, not in the 1890s, but later on in the early 1900s. Women did start owning these parcels of land and the buildings on them. And in Bozeman, women started owning property a little bit sooner. They started owning the property in the 1880s. So that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about as well. So let's see. So that's Big Timber. Let's move on to Dillon. So now we're going to look at Dillon. And Dillon is very much like Big Timber in that it is a railroad town. And so, of course, the red light district was located right next to the railroad. Railroad is right up here. But the thing about Dillon is that Dillon's main street is actually called Montana Street, and that's located right here too. So in Dillon, it's right next to Main Street, right next to the railroad. Dillon in 1897 had 5 houses of prostitution, of course, also right next to the Chinese community, which is in blue there. And also women did own property in Dillon as well. Now, interesting in Dillon, the red light district in Dillon was known as the Island. And women who worked in prostitution bought and sold these properties in Dillon. And this big brick building right here was kind of the centerpiece of the Island red light district in Dillon. And it was called the Big Red Brick, or the Big Brick building. So there's lots of references in newspapers to the Big Brick. And everyone in town probably knew what that was all about. So one thing about Dillon that was really interesting is they had a thriving Chinese population. And their Chinese population, their Chinese community was very well laid out and very structured when doing the research. So that was interesting, much more so than Bozeman. Of course, much more so than Big Timber that I found when doing the research as well. So now I want to go to Billings and just talk a little bit about Billings. I didn't get to do the research in Billings. I never came over and did the deed research here or did as much research because you guys have so much information here at the Western Heritage Center, and you do walking tours of the red light district. So I'm going to give the audience that lives in Billings anyway some homework to come and look at Billings Red Light District and ask some questions of the tour guides. And ask some of those questions that I've been asking of these other red light districts. Ask about if women owned these properties. Ask if the Chinese community was close. They'll probably tell you all about that. And the walking tour is called Bars, Brothel, and Bok Choy. And there is one tonight, which is June 18th. And so if you're watching this on the day, there is one tonight at 6 p.m. And then you will be doing tours throughout the summer. So if you would like to come on that walking tour, I highly suggest it. So let's dive into Billings a little bit. Now Billings, of course, is the largest red light district of all the districts we've looked at so far. And is probably one of the largest districts in Montana, besides, you know, Butte and Helena and those places as well. But Billings Red Light District is located along Minnesota Avenue, which is right next to the railroad, of course, is railroad town. And there, as time went on, this district, I think, did hop over the tracks as well. But in 1896, this is the district. Now, of course, there's a lot of buildings in red here, aren't there? There are a lot of brothels, and most of them, it looks like all of them in 1896 were wood frame buildings, so no brick at this point. And the Chinese community is right next to the red light district. It is right there next to it. And so I encourage you to go on the walking tour and look at the red light district now. It looks a little different, huh? So this is a view of the red light district today. And as we've kind of gone through these towns, I've been showing the pictures of the red light districts currently. And in Bozeman, we still have 2 buildings remaining. Maybe I'll just go back so I can show you those. We still have 2 buildings that are remaining in the red light district. One building, which is, of course, the building where Extreme History has our offices, which was originally a brick building but now is stuccoed white. And then we have one that is behind this building that's actually in that area that was called China Alley. And this was a brothel that was used by the Chinese, and they had Chinese women within this place. And so those are the 2 buildings that still remain in Bozeman's red light district. In Big Timber's red light district, no buildings remain. So none of the buildings that are here on the Sanborn map remain. And all of the buildings have been torn down over time. And there's a gas station here, kind of where this area is, right over here, and then there's just parking lots. So, of course, now red light districts are often parking lots, I found. And then in Dillon, kind of same thing. Might even be the same company that has the gas station there, I'm not sure. But gas station kind of area there, all modern buildings, so no buildings remain of the Dillon red light district either. And then you'll have to go on the walking tour to find out if there's any remaining buildings from the Billings red light district. So that gives you kind of an overview of these 4 places that I kind of did a deep dive into and looked at and stood on the place and kind of wanted to know more about them. But of course that just brought up more questions and some interesting facts and some interesting other things that I hadn't thought about before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. So one thing that I learned in doing this research is that some of these women, the madams, and when I say madam, I mean the woman who was kind of the head of household, I learned that these women were not just in the sex business. So they were in a lot of other different businesses. They had a lot of, their hands in a lot of different things in order to make money. And that's why they were successful. And that's why they were madams in these houses, is because they did diversify. So they were not just in prostitution, but they also were in the sale of alcohol and probably drugs. They were also in the sale in real estate business. They would buy and sell real estate quite frequently. And then they were also in the jewelry business. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these things. So alcohol and drugs, of course, were a huge part of any of these red light districts. And if you read any, you probably have this ingrained in your head from all the things you've read about red light districts, all the things you've seen of red light districts. And that part of it is true. There was a lot of alcohol being consumed before Prohibition anyway, but probably after Prohibition as well. So in each house, the first order of business was to set up the drinks. So men were often charged $1 per drink in the houses of ill repute. They could get that same drink just down the street at the local saloon for 25 cents. But many of them chose to get that drink in the house, often in the parlor house. It was a refined place where they could have a drink and chat with some ladies. So this aspect of it, this setting up the drinks, and the saloon aspect of these businesses were very lucrative. Madams would procure a saloon business license, as you see here. So here we have a license of Grace McGinnis, who was a madam living in Bozeman in 1895. And she paid $87 per quarter for this license. And so in 1895, that's a heck of a lot of money. $87 per quarter. And so the lady down the street, remember in Bozeman that I talked about, Mrs. Elmira Frazier, she paid $2.50 for her business license. So and that was just a boarding, hotel boarding room license. But you can see that these ladies must have been making a heck of a lot of money in order to pay $87 every quarter for their business license. So, also, there's a lot of evidence of this, of course, in newspaper accounts, but there have been a few madams who have written tell-all books after they've done they quit the business, and then they wrote these tell-all books. So there's a few of those books out there, and one is by Josie Washburn, and it's a really interesting book. It's called The Underworld Sewer, and she was a madam in Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska. And so when she quit the business, she wrote this book about all the evils of the houses of prostitution. And one of the things she says in her book is, the greatest profit of a house is made on the beer and wine sold. And if the keeper becomes wealthy, it is mostly through this channel that it is accomplished. So she talks a lot about that. She actually wrote a few other pamphlets about alcoholism and violence in these houses as well. So real estate, let's talk about real estate. So as I was doing the deed research in all of these districts, I was noticing that in the 1800s, the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, a few women owned property in these districts, but it became much more, there were many more women owning property in districts after the turn of the century. So that's when they really got into the real estate game. But like I said, women were owning these places. And in Bozeman, we have women owning businesses, their houses of ill repute in the 1870s, 1880s. But in Big Timber, they didn't own things till after the turn of the century. And so this is a deed from Eva Sinclair, who was a black woman who owned a house in Big Timber. And then this one is from the newspaper, and this is Maddie Briscoe Hill, who bought some property in Dillon. And so there is a lot of women owning these places after a time. And women didn't just own the brothels they worked in or the brothels they managed, but they owned property in other parts of town as well. And they owned ranches outside of town. They owned, they bought and sold property back and forth between themselves and between other people. So real estate was a big part of their wealth at this time. Now, the other and the most fascinating part of the wealth building that I found when doing this research was jewelry or jewels. So, of course, that's another part of that stereotypical typical image of a madam is that she's just drenched in jewels. She has, you know, diamond earrings, and she has diamond necklaces and rings galore and all those things. And but that was actually reality. They did have a lot of jewels, and some madams chose to wear those jewels, and some did not. And so jewels were a way for these prostitutes to invest and hold their wealth. So here I have the probate records for a woman who worked in Bozeman. Her name was Libby Hayes, and she worked in the house we have our offices in for about 10 years. And then she died young. A lot of these ladies died young because it was a hard life. And so she died young of uterine cancer. She got sick with uterine cancer when she was about 34 years old and died. And so this is the inventory on her probate. And it starts with one diamond necklace worth $1,000, and this is in 1913. One diamond brooch worth $200. One diamond ring, one cluster diamond ring worth $175. One diamond ring, a princess diamond, for $175. So that's a lot of money and jewels. And these jewels were important because, of course, a lot of times there were raids on these red light districts. And a police force would come in the middle of the night and raid these houses and push all the people in the houses out. And so jewels were a really easy thing to just have in your drawer, grab them all, put them in your pocket, and take off, head to the railroad station, and head on to the next town. So it was a good way to keep your wealth close to you when you were sleeping, but also close to you when you were up and out and wearing your jewels. So it was a good way to kind of hold that wealth. And Libby's sister, Hattie Hayes, there was 3 sisters in Bozeman, Hattie, Maddie, and Libby. And so Hattie Hayes, one of the sisters, the 3 sisters, she worked in Bozeman until about 1920. And then she left Bozeman and she headed to Casper, Wyoming. And she worked in Casper, Wyoming for the rest of her life. And so I kind of been able to track her pretty long term. And towards the end of her life, she still had jewels that she was pawning for coal. So she needed some heat one winter, and she was down to not much money. And so she pawned one of her jewels for some coal to keep her house heated that winter. So those jewels came in handy much later as well. So so let me just tell you about these. So this woman's name was Josephine Airy, and she was a Helena madam. And you can see that she has some jewels on her fingers there. She has some fabulous earrings. She's got a pearl necklace, it looks like. So she's wearing all her jewels. And of course, in this photograph, this is a portrait photograph. And so she wanted to put all those jewels on display to show her wealth as well. And then we have our Billings madam, whose name was Olive Warren, or Ollie Warren. And she has this big, wonderful brooch that she's wearing here, and possibly diamond earrings, possibly pearl earrings. And so she's exhibiting some of that wealth. I think this photo was from earlier in her career, so maybe by the end she had a few more jewels to display. But the story goes with Ollie Warren is that when she opened her first house of ill repute, the house was named the Lucky Diamond because there was one of her gentleman friends who gave her a diamond. They gave her enough money to open this house, the Lucky Diamond. So I bet you guys talk about the Lucky Diamond on your tour as well. So there's some much more fascinating things to tell about the Lucky Diamond that I won't talk about here today. But it was named for this very large diamond that this gentleman friend gave her. And the Lucky Diamond house that Ollie Warren built was actually a 2-story structure, and inside there were red velvet drapes, lavish furnishings, large mirrors, and a mahogany bar. So if you just picture that. So as we're moving through this, I was moving through this research, and as I've been thinking about this, over the last couple of years as we've been in this building, I've been thinking about these women a lot and thinking about their agency. And when I mean that, I mean Did these women have agency? Did they have independence? Were they able to function themselves independently? And I have to say, I waffle on this a bit. Sometimes I think, oh my gosh, these women had agency. I mean, look at Ollie Warren, look at that look on her face. She had agency. And then I think, and then I read other accounts, and I think, no, these women didn't have any agency. Were they able to navigate these landscapes of vice to their advantage through their economic benefits that came to them? Not only the women who worked for them, but also through the buying and selling of property, the investing in jewelry, and the operating of saloons, either within or outside their houses. With this economic ability, they were able to make were they able to make choices and reap the rewards of those choices within these confined spaces of these red light districts. So possibly these women had limited agency. I do want to make it clear, though, that only a few women living within each district may have had this agency if they did have it. I also want to make clear that no woman would willingly come to this life. The only reason they found themselves in the district was for survival as a result of poverty or drug abuse or trauma. As Mary Murphy has argued in her thesis, Women on the Line, women in urban settings were unable to work for a living wage unless they became domestic servants, which was not an attractive option for so many reasons, including low pay, super long hours, pretty much 24/7 hours, sexual harassment from their employers, and poor working conditions. The only way that these women working in domestic servant could survive is because they were given that room and board. So as we think about this time, this 1890s, early 1900s, women didn't have a lot of work options open to them. So I just want to come back to our friend Josie Washburn a little bit and illustrate this point with a quote from that book that I talked about, The Underground Sewer. And she says, she kind of goes through the night of a madam. She kind of talks in this book kind of about how a night works, in a brothel, which is, kind of interesting. And at the end of it, she says, there's a big pile of money in the drawer. Have been paid for the work we have done tonight? She asks herself, can money pay us for the work we do here? Can all the wealth in the world pay us for what we are doing? How would it be to throw it in the street? No. It buys our food. How would it be to commit suicide? No, for that would be murder. Then, my God, what shall I do? Show me a way, she prays, to leave it all behind. And so that shows a little bit of that desperation. And of course, these women had that desperation because they had to feed themselves. They often had to feed themselves and their families that lived somewhere else. They had to make a life for themselves in this place where it was hard to find a job and actually receive income. So I haven't really answered my question about agency or any of this. So I throw it out to all of you to think about it yourselves and let me know what you think. But I just wanted to come back because we've been talking about the lives of these women in the red light district. We've been talking about these landscapes of vice with during the time that these women were living here, that these people were operating in these landscapes. But we can see a lot, we can understand a lot about a community by looking at these red light districts. We can understand what the community values. We can understand what the community did not value by looking at these confined red light districts. And I have to say I love cemeteries, so I always try to look at the cemetery within this as well. And so, and Nancy Mahoney, who's here in the audience tonight, we talked about the life of these women, but then we also talked about the death of these women and talked about where they went after they died based on the work they had done during their life. And so we looked at the cemetery, and we looked at the cemetery with that in mind to think about, well, a cemetery is much like really does talk about the values of the community. It really shows you the values of a community. So let's see where these women were in death. Were they confined to a specific area like they are in life? And so I'm just going to use the example of the Bozeman community. And every community is a little bit different on this front, I'll just say that. But in Bozeman, here's a map, kind of a plain view map of our cemetery, and the yellow dots are where the madams are buried. 5 madams are buried. So over here, this yellow dot, we have Frances Butner and Kitty Warren. They were sisters. They both died young. They're buried there together. One died of an overdose. She committed suicide by overdosing. The other died after accidentally setting her skirts on fire. So both very tragic deaths. So those 2 sisters are buried there. There's 2 other sisters buried over here with this little dot, Hattie and Libby Hayes. And Hattie, Libby is the woman I talked about before. She was the madam in the house that we are in for about 10 years. She died of uterine cancer, like I said. Her sister Hattie had died just a few years before her. Her sister Hattie was only 29 when she died. And we don't really know, she died of sepsis, which is an infection of the blood. And that was probably from maybe syphilis, maybe a venereal disease of some kind. She had open sores on her body, and that's how she got sepsis. So, you know, rough lives for these women and rough deaths for these women. This is the place where a woman whose name was, her name was Lizzie Woods. And she was the madam that lived in that big parlor house that I showed you on the corner there in Bozeman. And she lived till she was about 65 years old, and then she died basically of living a hard life. Maybe alcoholism was the cause of her death. But you probably don't know Bozeman Cemetery, but Bozeman Cemetery, these women are buried right amongst all the other folks who lived their lives in Bozeman and worked in Bozeman. They're just scattered kind of in amongst everybody else. So they are not confined anymore. So in life they were confined to the district. In death, they are not confined any longer. They are just buried out with everybody. But kind of coming back to our talking about the Chinese community, they were confined to an area in the Bozeman Cemetery. And they are over here where this yellow square is. So all the Chinese and Japanese were confined to that area. So in death, the Chinese were also confined as in life as well. So that is the landscape of the cemetery. Now I know that in other towns, the prostitutes were also confined to the outskirts of the cemetery. They were not buried in amongst. So in other cemeteries and other towns in Montana, that is the case. So you'll have to ask your tour guides in Billings what happened, where these women were buried in Billings. It'd be interesting to find out. And maybe ask especially where Ollie Warren was buried. So in conclusion, red light districts are complex landscapes, and I've just started my journey, as I said, into these fascinating places. Women were confined to these very restricted districts, which sometimes paired with the local Chinese community. The grouping of the Chinese and the ladies was a way of confining vice, a place most women found themselves due to poverty and trauma. These districts were always right in the heart of the community, just 1 or 2 blocks off of Main Street or just across the street from the railroad station, easily accessible. Survival was the reason women became prostitutes. No woman, like I said before, would choose this life. But once they arrived, some women maybe were able to climb that ladder, that prostitution ladder, and set goals and accomplish those goals, showing that limited amount of agency, possibly. The landscape of vice changed dramatically in 1917, 1918 with the closure of red light districts across Montana due to the national movement by the U.S. government as we entered World War I. Montana's sex workers didn't move into other jobs, of course. These women had been prostitutes. They were labeled as prostitutes. They couldn't go work at the corner store after being a prostitute. So, of course, their work didn't change. They just went into different places. They went into working at the, in the back room of the hotel or the back room of the saloon, or they worked in assignation houses, or they walked the streets. The parlor houses that the madams had run were a thing of the past, however, in 1918. I'm not glorifying the parlor houses, but they were a much safer place for women to work, much safer than walking the streets, for example. So I'll leave you with one last image, and this is kind of coming back to Lizzie Woods, that parlor house in Bozeman. And in 1863, this house was demolished. A local by the name of Harvey Griffin wrote an article in the Gallatin Tribune that reminisced on Bozeman's earlier days and this house that once belonged to the infamous Lizzie Woods. The article's author, Griffin, says, quote, "Back at the Bozeman Hotel, they are wrecking a house that was once the recreation center for early day Bozeman. A landmark of the town, its upper story raised, its bricks lying scattered mounds, its empty vacant windows have that haunted remembering stare, like the eyes of old men sitting on the poorhouse steps and watching for someone who would never come. Old things, if we watch them, have a very human quality, and that is because they have been intimately connected with the people who have those qualities themselves. Certainly, this old house was closely connected with the robust life of early Bozeman. The people who entered its portals were intensely human. Good or bad, this house was an important part of the West's adolescence. As some of the old-timers might say, sin is such a comfort when you get to know it." So thank you, everybody, for being here today, and thanks for coming, and hopefully you can go on the bars, brothels, and bok choy tour sometime this summer. Thanks.
And actually, I just thank you so much, because that was awesome. I just wanted to say a couple words about the Extreme History Project. And so, like Crystal said, very nice plug for our walking tours, which are critical to our outreach and support that we get from the community. But also, I really encourage anybody who goes to Bozeman to do walking tours with the Extreme History Project. They're the only organization doing historic walking tours in the Bozeman area, and obviously we now have a lot of questions for us to answer with our prostitution research and stuff like that. So they're very interesting about the cemetery. Will I give it away if I say where Ollie Warren was buried? Ollie Warren, who's our most famous madam, has a reserved spot at the Billings Mausoleum, which is the best place for all the who's who of Billings. So she understood when that opening came that she was going to get her spot there. So, and we are joined in the audience today with Nancy Mahoney from Bozeman, and she is our speaker on July 16. At this point, we haven't decided, if we're going to open it up to the public. If we do, it might be a limited, first come, kind of first serve, where we have 15 or 20 people. And Nancy's program on July 16 is Indians, Amateurs, and Archaeologists, Artifact Collecting in Montana, 1880 to 1950. I've actually heard the program. It's really interesting because the influence of amateurs in archaeology in Montana is an amazing story in itself, in that transition to kind of professionalism in terms of the discipline. So we have Nancy Mahoney on July 16. On July 30, we have Barbara Van Cleve is coming from Big Timber, who's a photographer, a ranch woman, very interesting storyteller, and she's doing a program called Montana Through and Through, the photographic legacy of Barbara Van Cleve. So a couple programs in July. As I said, watch us on Facebook or on our website, and you'll get a sense of, first come, first serve. We have some really loyal people who love to come to these programs live, so I could see people coming here at 10 and us having to shut the doors at 11, but we will let you know. And again, just wanted to do one more thing, which is our sponsor today. We were able to bring Community 7 in, and Lindsay and Tim and Roberta to film the programs. And also, we can feed our speakers, which is a big deal. So we did get sponsorship for this program. Michelle and Conrad Karen, who have always been big supporters of the museum, yay, we love them, supported that. And when you look at the list of programs, I'm telling you, you're like, oh, prostitution, I want to do that one, right? So anyway, thank you so much, and hope to see you soon at the Heritage Center.